Why did they laugh when she fell? Her body struck the water with a brutal finality, the kind that silences a heartbeat for half a second before it resumes its rhythm. Hands tied behind her back, ankles lashed with rope that cut into her skin, Arya Monroe sank like stone. The pool swallowed her whole, 20 meters of chlorinated stillness waiting to suffocate her. Above, the desert sun bore down on Fort Arclight's naval training yard, baking the concrete, searing uniforms, and burning into the recruits, pride like fire branding cattle. The laughter started immediately, nervous, cruel, and eager. Some leaned forward on their elbows, hopping to see panic, thrashing limbs, wild gasps, the desperate fight of someone who had no chance. They had seen it before. On drown-proofing day, the pool had broken Olympic swimmers, triathletes, and hardened operators alike. And to them, Arya was no different. In fact, to them, she was less. They had whispered it for weeks, that she didn't belong, that she was taking a slot meant for someone harder, someone stronger, someone male. They dismissed her silence as fear, her crisp uniform as pretense, her posture as an act. Invisible, that's what they called her when she walked past, when they thought she couldn't hear. She wore invisibility like armor, but armor doesn't float. Dead weight. Sergeant Blake Core's voice cut through the dry air like gravel dragged across metal. He paced the edge of the pool, boots grinding against concrete, arms folded. He didn't bother with instructions. There weren't any. Survive or get pulled out limp. His smirk said it all. He'd already decided she'd fail. 10 seconds, a recruit muttered. Another chuckled. Their eyes stayed on the water's surface, waiting for the ripple of panic. But below, Arya's world was quiet. The cold pressure wrapped her chest, squeezing, dragging her into memories she had buried deep. Montana, age 12. A swollen river, its current a living beast ripping air from her lungs. Boys on the bank, laughing at the girl who slipped. The water had swallowed her then, too, and for a moment she had believed it would keep her. Until her father's voice cut through the terror. Panic kills faster than water. That truth had saved her once. It would save her now. She tucked her chin, steadied her breathing. No thrashing, no struggle. Lungs burned, but her mind was calm. Count the heartbeats, not the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Rhythm, not fear. Above, the laughter faltered. The surface was too still. Where was the chaos, the splashing, the spectacle? A recruit leaned closer. Where is she? His voice cracked. Core's smirk twitched. He told himself she was finished. The pool always did the dirty work. Yet his jaw betrayed him, tightening with each second of silence. At the far end of the deck, Captain Elias Rain didn't watch the water. His eyes stayed on the rugged tablet in his hands, stylus scratching, stopwatch ticking. He wasn't measuring failure. He was measuring time. Patience was his weapon. Arya slipped deeper, rope biting her ankles, lungs tightening like a vice. She closed her eyes, counting again. Not seconds, not fear, heartbeats. 1, 2, 3, bob, sip, sink. She breached for a stolen breath, silent as a ghost, then vanished again. No splash, no panic. Above, shadows leaned over the edge. Recruits shifted, uneasy. The silence felt wrong. She should be thrashing by now. But she was. At the bottom, Arya bent her knees. Rope ground against her skin, coarse, unrelenting. The knot was doubled, wrapped over itself, meant to hold tight under struggle. To most, it was iron. To her, it was opportunity. She flexed, twisted, tiny, controlled movements. Not freedom, not yet. But cracks always start small. Pain seared through her ankles, flesh tore. Blood salted the water, confirmation. The fibers were moving. She surfaced again. A single breath, back down, knuckles scraping blindly against the rope, skin splitting open. Again, another sip of air, another dive. This time her fingers found a gap, small, sharp, enough. She pried, ignoring the sting of torn skin. The rope groaned, shifted, slipped. Above, a gasp broke through the line of recruits. No way. Core's smirk collapsed into disbelief. He had seen drown-proofing trials 100 times. They always broke, always ended in limp bodies dragged up. Not this, not her. Rain's stylus paused. His jaw tightened, he knew. One leg kicked free. Arya didn't celebrate. She drove diagonally for the wall, anchoring herself with raw precision. Her chest slammed into tile, shoulders rolled, and with a final surge she vaulted out of the pool, collapsing onto the sun-baked deck. Water poured from her uniform, wrists still bound, one ankle still tethered, but she was breathing steady, deliberate, alive. Silence pressed heavier than the desert heat. The recruits, moments ago laughing, now stared like they'd seen a ghost rise from the water. They had waited for weakness but witnessed control. They had mocked invisibility, but invisibility had hidden strength. Arya rose to her knees, hair dripping, eyes hard. She scanned their faces. She saw the sneers twist into unease, the laughter hollow into shame. Kor took a step forward, fists tight, but the words stuck in his throat. Nothing could explain what they had seen. Rain finally spoke, voice low, almost clinical. Nightshade marker observed, protocol pending confirmation. His words weren't for the recruits, they were a verdict. Arya inhaled, slow and steady. The desert sun carved steel across her shoulders. She had not only endured the impossible, she had dismantled it, piece by piece, breath by breath. And somewhere deep inside, she felt the weight shift. For weeks she had been invisible, dismissed, humiliated. Now she was undeniable. Yet she said nothing. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Why didn't she look afraid? Water still dripped from her uniform, pooling at her boots, but Arya stood tall now, wrists bound, rope trailing from one ankle. Her chest rose and fell with deliberate rhythm, not the ragged gasps of survival but the steady cadence of someone in control. For the first time since she arrived at Fort Arclight, she allowed her silence to speak louder than their noise. The recruits froze. They had jeered, mocked, dismissed her. They had leaned forward to see weakness. And now not one of them could move. The pool hadn't drowned her. It had resurrected her. Sergeant Blake Kor's fists clenched. His voice, usually cutting and loud, faltered in his throat. The smirk he wore like armor was gone, replaced with a twitch of disbelief. "No one does that," he muttered, though even he didn't believe it. Arya's eyes locked on his. She saw what he was trying to hide, the fear. He had built his authority on breaking others down. But what happens when someone doesn't break? She bent at the waist, rolling her shoulders, and with a sudden sharp crack the rope snapped against her hip. Wet fibers split, falling at her feet with the weight of a gunshot. The sound ripped through the silence. Gasps erupted. One recruit whispered, "Impossible." Another muttered, "She cheated." But no one truly believed that. They had seen her struggle, seen the blood feather into the pool, seen the precision of her movements. That wasn't cheating. That was mastery. Captain Elias Rain stepped forward, boots sharp against concrete, tablet in one hand. His voice was official, clipped, leaving no room for doubt. Nightshade protocol verified. The recruits stiffened. The words meant nothing to them, but the tone, the precision of his salute said everything. He wasn't speaking to a recruit. He was speaking to someone above his rank. Arya lifted her chin. The awkwardness that had shadowed her posture for weeks dissolved. Shoulders squared, spine straight. Command radiated from her in waves, undeniable and heavy. Rain snapped to attention. His salute cut through the desert air. "Major Monroe, evaluation complete." The yard erupted, gasps, whispers, disbelief spilling into the blistering sunlight. "Major." She was all along. No, no way. Their world shattered in a single word. Kor staggered forward, rage boiling up to cover his shame. "This is a setup. She provoked me. She cheated the drill." His voice cracked as if shouting could hide his fear. Arya turned slowly, her gaze slicing into him. Her voice was low, calm, lethal. "If weakness is enough to provoke abuse, Sergeant, then you were unfit to lead before you ever opened your mouth." Kor froze. The fury drained from his face, leaving only pale silence. Rain's tone snapped like thunder. Sergeant Blake Core, effective immediately, you are suspended from training authority. Report to headquarters, now. The order cut the last thread holding Core's arrogance together. He hesitated, jaw tight, then shoved past Arya toward the exit. Dust kicked under his boots. He didn't look back, but her voice followed him, low enough only he could hear. It ended the moment you mistook cruelty for strength. His steps faltered. For the first time, Blake Core knew what it felt like to be powerless. The recruits stood rigid, unsure if they should salute, speak, or vanish into the desert air. Their laughter, their jeers, their whispers, all hung in memory like ghosts. Arya turned her gaze across them, steady and unflinching. She pinned each face in place, reminding them of every word spoken when they thought no one important was listening. She said nothing, and the silence was heavier than any speech. Rain finally turned, his voice sharp, official. Attention! You stand in the presence of Major Arya Monroe, decorated combat operative, former Ghost Program officer, and your new commanding officer. You will treat her as such. The words detonated across the formation. Some flinched, some stared pale and speechless. A few, instinctively, straightened into rigid posture, recognizing authority when it stood before them. Arya let the revelation settle. She had endured their laughter. She had been invisible by choice. Every second of humiliation had been part of the test, and now came the reckoning. Her boots echoed as she stepped forward. The recruits followed her with their eyes, tension thick enough to suffocate. "I've watched you for 18 days, she said, voice measured, each syllable sharp as a blade. Not your push-ups, not your ruck times, not how far you can run or how many miles you can carry weight. I've watched your character." The words slid across the formation, like a blade drawn slow. Character is revealed when you think no one who matters is watching. Faces dropped, some hardened in defiance, others in shame. Every one of them remembered the laughter, the way they'd turned their backs when she fell into the pool, the whispers behind her back, the easy cruelty. Arya paused, then lifted a hand pointing, you, and you." 3 recruits stiffened, Corporal Jace Renner, Specialist Hannah Lee, Private Miguel Torres, their names echoed in silence. The others stared, confused, tense, waiting for condemnation. But Arya's tone shifted, firm but not unkind. "You 3 showed the quality special operations demands, courage without recognition, loyalty without reward, leadership without needing a title." Gasps rippled through the line. The rest shifted uncomfortably, dust stirring under their boots. They knew who they had been, and for the first time some began to realize this wasn't about strength of muscle or speed of feet. It was about how you carried power, whether you used it to protect or to mock. Arya crouched slowly, scooping a handful of dry dirt from the ground. She lifted it, letting the earth sift between her fingers. Grains scattered into the hot desert wind, vanishing one by one. "The ground doesn't care who you are," she said quietly. "Doesn't care where you came from or what name is stitched on your uniform. The ground asks only one question when you're thrown down." She let the last grains fall from her palm. The recruits held their breath. "Will you rise?" The words settled heavy. Some swallowed hard, some shifted uneasily. A few looked at the dirt still clinging to her skin, the shame of their laughter etched into their posture. Arya straightened, brushing her hands clean. "Most of you failed that test," she said, "and that's not punishment, it's direction. Some of you will serve elsewhere. Maybe someday you'll learn what true strength means. But the ones who remain," her eyes returned to Renner Lee Torres, "will begin training under me, and I will push you harder than Core ever dreamed. But I will never humiliate you to prove my power." Her voice hardened, echoing across the yard. "Because power that needs to break others to exist is weakness." Rain closed his tablet with a snap, nodding once. Evaluation complete, transformation begun. Arya's gaze swept across them one last time. Water still dripped from her uniform, sunlight glinting off her combat decorations. But it wasn't medals or titles that filled the yard. It was presence. Command earned, not demanded. You want to know the difference between cruelty and leadership. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. The recruits leaned in without meaning to. Cruelty breaks people down to make itself feel taller. Leadership builds people up until they discover they can stand taller than they ever imagined. Silence. Then movement. A single recruit at the far end shifted to attention, another followed, then another. One by one, the entire formation straightened, not in fear, not in shame, in respect. For the first time, they weren't looking at a weak recruit. They were looking at a leader. Arya let the silence linger, then turned to Rain, nodding. Dismiss them. The recruits broke formation, boots scuffing across the desert yard. But her words lingered, hanging heavy in the sun-baked air. Words that would outlast the day, outlast their shame, and maybe outlast their careers. True strength isn't proven by how many you can break. It's proven by how many you refuse to let fall. What happens after silence breaks? The recruits had snapped to attention, their spines stiff as iron rods in the desert sun. Respect had replaced mockery. Fear had given way to something else, something they didn't yet have words for. But respect is not loyalty, and silence is not yet understanding. Arya Monroe knew this. She had lived it before. Her boots scraped against the sun-baked concrete as she stepped forward, water still dripping from her uniform. Her eyes swept across the formation, not searching for strength, but for character. It wasn't the sharpest shooters or the fastest runners who shaped the outcome of war. It was the ones who carried the weight of others when everything threatened to break. Yet as she stood before them, their faces a mix of shame, awe, and unease, she felt a knot tighten in her chest. It wasn't pride. It wasn't relief. It was something heavier. Because she remembered the last time soldiers had looked at her this way, on a different continent in a different war, and she remembered how quickly respect could turn into expectation. And expectation, if unmet, could turn into betrayal. She pushed the thought away. That wound would not open here, not yet. Tomorrow, she said, her voice steady, we begin again. The games are over. The masks are gone. What you do from this point will decide if you belong here. Her words cut the air clean, leaving nothing behind. Rain dismissed the formation with a sharp command, and the recruits broke apart in uncertain silence, some stealing glances back at her, as though trying to reconcile the person they had mocked with the leader who now held their fate. When the yard finally emptied, Arya stood alone by the pool, the ropes at her feet, water drying on her uniform. The desert wind brushed against her, carrying the grit of sand, the weight of memory. She crouched, fingertips grazing the rope fibers. Her skin was raw where the knots had bitten in, blood dried into faint lines. She stared at it, and for a moment she wasn't in Nevada anymore. She was back in Kandahar. A different pool, this one dark with dust, its water murky with oil and smoke, bound the same way, dropped the same way. Only that time there was no crowd of laughing recruits, no drill sergeant with a stopwatch, only silence broken by the muffled voices of men who had dragged her there, enemies who thought they'd found a way to break the ghost program's strongest. Her heartbeat quickened. Panic had almost claimed her then, almost, but she had learned. Control was survival, precision was freedom. She had escaped. She had lived, but pieces of her had never come back. She shook the memory loose and rose. This was Kandahar. This was Arclight, and she wasn't the one being tested anymore. Yet deep down she knew the truth. Tests never ended, not for people like her. The next morning broke with a pale desert sun, the kind that cast everything in stark relief. The recruits assembled at dawn, lines straight but expressions uncertain. They had trained under Corps with fear, humiliation, and mockery. Now, facing Arya, they didn't know what to expect. She arrived without fanfare, hair tied back, uniform crisp, expression unreadable. The pool ropes were gone. Only her presence carried the weight of yesterday. "Form up," she said, voice even. They snapped to. Her eyes passed over them, Tor's standing rigid, still carrying the weight of disbelief. Lee quiet, her gaze steady, protective even when unspoken. Renner jaw tight as though bracing for a fight, and the others' faces etched with doubt, resistance, curiosity. Arya folded her hands behind her back. "You've been trained to obey orders. That much I know, but obedience isn't enough. If obedience were strength, every tyrant would win." The words lingered. Some recruits shifted uncomfortably, unsure where she was leading them. "I don't care how fast you run. I don't care how many push-ups you can do. What I care about," she continued, her voice sharp, "is how you carry the person next to you when they fall. Because they will fall. And so will you. And when that moment comes, strength isn't measured in muscle. It's measured in choice." Her gaze locked on Tor's. "Step forward." He obeyed, boots heavy on the dirt. "Drop your pack," she ordered. He unstrapped his ruck, letting it thud to the ground. Arya turned her eyes to the formation. "Which of you will carry it for him?" Silence. The recruits looked at each other, uneasy. Some glanced at the pack, others at the dirt, hoping someone else would step forward. No one moved. Arya let the silence stretch, heavy as lead. Then she crouched, lifted the pack herself, and slung it over her shoulders. It was weighted, meant to break a recruit over a long march, but she wore it as if it were nothing. "Do you see?" she asked quietly. "Power is not about standing above others. It's about carrying the weight they cannot." Her words landed sharper than any drill. Some recruits looked away in shame. Others stared, something shifting behind their eyes. She dropped the pack at Tor's feet. "Lesson 1 begins now." The days that followed were different. Gone were the humiliations, the public mockery, the cruel tests meant to draw weakness like blood from a wound. Instead, Arya's drills were designed to reveal character. She set tasks where recruits had to rely on each other, navigation exercises where one mistake doomed the team, endurance tests where carrying another meant survival, silence drills where trust was the only weapon. The first week they failed, miserably. Arguments erupted. Some recruits cheated to make themselves look stronger. Others abandoned teammates. Arya watched it all in silence, her face unreadable, her notes deliberate. But slowly cracks appeared in their pride, and through those cracks something else began to grow. Renner, once defiant, began taking responsibility. Tors, hesitant and uncertain, discovered strength in supporting others. Lee, quiet but unyielding, emerged as the glue holding her group together. And Arya. She pushed them harder than Kor ever had, but her pressure was never cruel. It was deliberate, measured. She broke them only in ways that allowed them to rise again. Yet at night, when the desert cooled and silence filled the barracks, Arya lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The shadows of her past pressed against her chest like old scars. She had thought she could bury Kandahar, bury the nights where ropes cut her skin and voices in foreign tongues promised she would never rise again. But watching these recruits, watching them stumble, fail, and learn brought it all back. The pool, the ropes, the fear. And the truth she had never told anyone. That she hadn't just survived that night. She had taken a life to escape. The memory of his eyes still haunted her. The way the water had swallowed his last breath, the silence that had followed. She had lived, but part of her had drowned with him. Now, as she molded these recruits, she wondered, was she teaching them strength, or was she teaching them her ghosts? The thought kept her awake. And she knew, deep down, the day would come when the past she carried would no longer stay buried. Under the desert moonlight, Arya stood alone at the edge of the training yard, hands clasped behind her back, eyes scanning the horizon. She looked like stone, but inside she was anything but. Rain approached quietly, tablet tucked under his arm. He studied her profile, the rigidity, the stillness, the silence that wasn't peace but armor. "You know they're starting to follow you," he said. His voice was low, respectful. Arya didn't turn. Following isn't the same as trusting. Rain nodded slowly. "Trust takes time." Her jaw tightened. "Time is something I don't have." He studied her in silence, then asked the question he'd been holding back. "Why did you volunteer for this assignment, Major?" Arya's eyes stayed on the horizon. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "Because no one else wanted to." But deep down, she knew it wasn't the truth. The truth was darker. She hadn't come here to lead them. She had come here to see if she still could. Why did they keep looking at her when she turned away? Every morning after the pool, Arya noticed it, the shift. The recruits no longer laughed when she passed. They no longer whispered in corners when she tightened her boots or tied her hair. Their eyes followed her now, not with ridicule but with something closer to hunger. Hunger for understanding. Hunger for proof that the strength she carried could somehow become theirs. But hunger was dangerous. She knew this better than anyone. Hunger, if unmet, could rot into resentment. And if she failed to feed it with more than discipline, the fragile respect she'd won would collapse. So she gave them lessons they didn't expect. On the third week, she led them into the desert. The sun punished their skin, their packs dragged at their shoulders, sweat stung their eyes. Kor had used this march to break them, timed runs, brutal distances, his voice echoing mockery every step of the way. Arya did something different. She stopped halfway in the middle of nothing but sand and wind. "Drop your packs," she ordered. Confused, they obeyed. She crouched, drawing a circle in the sand with the edge of her boot. "This is where your comfort zone ends. Out here, the ground doesn't care how fast you are. Out here, strength is measured in how far you'll go for the person next to you." She pointed to Tors, who was pale and already struggling, sweat dripping down his brow. "He falls, you all fail, not because he's weak, because you chose not to carry him." A murmur ran through the formation. They weren't used to this. Kor had trained them to compete, to tear each other down, to prove they were faster, stronger, harder. But Arya was demanding something else, something harder. At first they resisted. Renner scoffed under his breath, though his eyes betrayed unease. A couple of others shifted in place, reluctant. But when Tors stumbled a mile later, dropping to his knees, Arya didn't move. She only watched. The silence was unbearable. Finally, Lee stepped forward. She slung Tor's arm over her shoulder, bearing half his weight. Then, to everyone's surprise, Renner joined her, grumbling but steady. They carried him together, and something shifted, a lesson that couldn't be measured in push-ups or miles. When they returned to base, broken and blistered, Arya said only one thing: "That's the first step." For the first time, they didn't groan or mutter. They just listened. But change was never simple. Respect from the recruits grew, yes, but shadows grew with it. Arya knew enough about power to recognize envy when she saw it. Some of the men who had laughed the hardest now saluted the sharpest, but their eyes carried a flicker of something else. Something that said they hadn't forgiven her for exposing them. And at night, when the yard fell silent and the desert cooled, her ghosts came back. She dreamed of Kandahar. The pool, the ropes, the hands that held her under, the moment her body had screamed for air, and the man she had dragged down with her to escape. She remembered the way the water swallowed his scream, the silence when he didn't surface. Her breath would catch in the darkness. She would sit up, sweat cold on her neck, the barracks quiet except for the faint snores of recruits who would never know what she had done to survive. But survival had a cost, and that cost was returning. She didn't know how she knew. She felt it in the way Captain Rain looked at her sometimes, the way his questions hovered on the edge of unasked. She felt it in the sealed orders on his desk. She felt it in the name she hadn't heard in years, whispered in her dreams. Kandahar hadn't stayed buried. And soon, someone would remind her of that. It came during a briefing. The recruits were gathered around the map table, notebooks open, pens scratching. Arya stood at the front, explaining the next evolution, an infiltration exercise across the canyon range. It was supposed to test navigation, endurance, and teamwork, nothing unusual. But halfway through, the door opened. A man stepped inside, uniform crisp, expression cold, Lieutenant Commander Harris. The recruit straightened instinctively, sensing the shift in authority. Rain's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Harris's eyes swept the room before landing on Arya. Major Monroe, orders from command. He held out a sealed folder. She took it, her face unreadable. She didn't open it, not yet. Harris lingered, as though savoring the weight in the air. Then, with a sharp nod, he left. The room buzzed with confusion, recruits exchanging glances. Arya silenced them with a look. "Focus on the exercise," she said, but her voice carried an edge, a tightness no one missed. Later, when the recruits filed out, Rain approached her. His eyes flicked to the folder still in her hand. "What's in it?" Arya didn't answer. She carried the orders to her quarters, closed the door, and sat at her desk. For a long time she didn't move. Finally, she broke the seal. Inside was a single page. Her breath caught. One word stared back at her. Retribution. And beneath it, a name she had buried in the dark. The man from Kandahar. The one who hadn't surfaced. Only now, the page said he hadn't died. Her hands shook. For the first time in years, they shook. She pressed her palms flat on the desk, grounding herself. It wasn't possible. She had felt his body go limp in the water. She had seen the stillness, the silence. She had lived because he had not. And yet, command didn't send false orders. If he was alive, then he was out there, and he hadn't forgotten her. Her chest tightened, breath shallow. She had worked so hard to bury the memory, to shape herself into someone unshakable. But now the past wasn't a ghost. It was flesh, and it was coming. The knock on her door startled her. She snapped the folder shut, forcing her voice steady. "Enter." It was Lee, standing awkwardly, her posture respectful but her eyes concerned. "Ma'am, some of the recruits, they're struggling with the new drills. They're not used to working for each other." Arya studied her, the sincerity, the courage it took to knock on her door. For a moment she envied Lee. She envied the kind of strength that wasn't built on ghosts, but on simple, steady loyalty. "Keep pushing them," Arya said quietly. "They'll break through." Lee nodded, but her eyes lingered, as if she could sense the weight Arya was hiding. Then she left, boots soft against the barracks floor. Arya sat back, staring at the folder. Her recruits were changing. They were learning what it meant to rise, not at the expense of others, but for them. But she wasn't sure she could rise again if the past truly came back. And in the silence of her quarters, she whispered the words she hadn't spoken in years. "Why did I live?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. But deep down, she knew the answer was coming. Not in words. In flesh. In retribution. Why did the desert suddenly feel colder at night? The recruits had gone to their bunks, exhaustion weighing down their bodies. Tors snored softly in the far corner. Rainier lay awake, staring at the ceiling, restless as ever. Lee, disciplined as stone, already slept. To them, tomorrow was another day of training under their new commanding officer. To Arya, tomorrow was a battlefield she hadn't chosen. The sealed folder sat on her desk. The words still burned into her mind, retribution, and the name beneath it, the one she thought the water had claimed years ago, the man she dragged into silence so she could live. Only he hadn't stayed in silence. The desert wind rattled the window. Arya sat motionless, her fingers curled against the desk until her knuckles ached. She could almost hear his voice, muffled by water, swallowed by time. She closed her eyes. The air in her quarters was thick, too thick, pressing down until her lungs screamed. She pushed to her feet, packing. Control. Control was survival. That lesson had carried her through the pool, through the jeers, through Kandahar, but now control trembled. A knock at her door cut through her spiral. "Enter." Rain stepped inside. His presence was quiet, deliberate, but his eyes were sharp. He'd seen the folder earlier, he knew. "What did command say?" he asked. Arya's lips pressed tight. Silence was her instinct. Silence was armor. But Rain had been there from the start, recording, measuring, watching when others had laughed. He had earned fragments of her trust. She met his eyes. "He's alive." Rain didn't flinch. He only nodded as though confirming something he'd already suspected. "Then this changes things." Arya shook her head. "It changes everything." For a long time they stood in silence. Then Rain leaned forward, his voice low. "The recruits don't know. They don't need to know. For them this is still training. But for you—" "For me," Arya cut in, her voice tightening, "this is unfinished." Rain studied her face. "You survived Kandahar. That should have been the end." Arya's eyes darkened. "It was never the end. Survival isn't freedom, it's debt." Her words lingered, sharp and heavy. Rain didn't press further. He only nodded once, turned, and left her to the silence. When the door closed, Arya sat again, her hands trembling despite herself. She pressed her palms flat on the folder. If he was alive, then he hadn't forgotten. And if command called it retribution, then it wasn't just her past anymore. It was about to become theirs. Her recruits, her responsibility, her test. The next morning dawned brutal and bright. The recruits assembled at the yard, dust swirling under their boots. Their eyes were sharper now, less defiant, more watchful. They had started to believe in her, even if they didn't understand her. Arya stood before them, the folder hidden, the weight of it tucked behind her rigid posture. She looked at their faces, faces that had once mocked, now listening. They didn't know what storm was coming. "Today," she said, voice sharp, "you march, but this isn't about distance. This isn't about speed. This is about trust. You'll move in silence. No one gets left behind." The recruits nodded. No questions this time. They moved out into the desert. The sun rose higher, heat pressing against their backs. Sand crunched under boots. Arya walked with them, silent, scanning their formation. She watched Renner help Tors with his straps without being asked. She saw Lee quietly check the compass against landmarks, correcting the course without demanding credit. Small things, signs of growth, signs of change. But her mind wasn't on the march. It was back in Kandahar. The man's face wouldn't leave her, his eyes wide in the water, the way his body had gone still, the silence after. She had carried that silence for years, and now command was telling her it hadn't been silence at all. She almost stumbled, catching herself with a sharp breath. None of the recruits noticed. They were too focused, too busy proving themselves under her gaze. But inside, Arya was breaking. Because if he was alive, then what she had done wasn't survival. It was betrayal. They returned to base at dusk, blistered and worn. Arya dismissed them with a short command. Most trudged back to the barracks without a word, but Lee lingered. "Major," she said softly, stepping closer, "something's different with you." Arya's jaw tightened. "Fall in with the others, specialist." Lee hesitated, then saluted and left. Arya watched her go, guilt gnawing at her chest. They trusted her. They believed in her. But how could she lead them when her past might tear them apart? That night sleep didn't come. Instead, the yard lights flickered. Shadows moved across the perimeter. Arya rose from her bunk, instinct sharp, senses alive. She slipped on her boots and stepped outside. The desert was quiet, too quiet. Then she saw him. At the far edge of the yard, beyond the wire fence, a figure stood. His silhouette was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, rigid stance. He didn't move, didn't call. He only watched. Her breath caught. It couldn't be. But it was. The man from Kandahar. Alive. For a moment the world tilted. The years between collapsed. She was back in the water, lungs burning, rope cutting into skin, his eyes locking on hers before the silence claimed him. Now silence again, but not death, not memory, flesh. Her heart pounded, she blinked and he was gone. Only the desert wind remained. Arya stood frozen, hands trembling at her sides. She whispered to the empty night, words no one else could hear. It was supposed to end. But deep down she knew the truth. It hadn't ended. It was only beginning. The next day she walked the yard with rigid control, but inside her mind roared. Rain caught her glance, his eyes narrowing. He hadn't seen the figure, but he saw the fracture in her armor. The recruits didn't know. They couldn't know, not yet. But Arya Monroe knew this. Her past had found her. Kandahar was no longer memory. It was here, alive and watching. And if she couldn't control it, it would consume not just her, but them all. Why did the desert always feel quietest before something broke? The recruits trained under her watch as if nothing had changed. To them, the pool was still a memory, the march a lesson, the desert just another test. They didn't know what Arya had seen beyond the fence the night before. They didn't hear the silence that wasn't emptiness but presence. But Arya knew. The man from Kandahar had stood there, watching, breathing, alive. She carried the weight of it into the yard the next morning, her posture rigid, her voice even, her orders sharp. To the recruits, she seemed as untouchable as ever, but inside her mind was fraying. Every face she scanned blurred into his. Every shout of cadence carried the echo of drowning lungs. Every footfall across the sand was a reminder that her survival had not been final. And worse, if he was alive, then command had known. They had waited years to tell her. Why now? Why here? Why with recruits who trusted her, who looked at her as though she were more than flesh, more than fear? The answer gnawed at her. Rain approached as the recruits finished a navigation drill. His tablet was tucked under his arm, his face unreadable. He didn't speak until they were alone, away from ears that strained for meaning. "You saw something last night," he said. It wasn't a question. Arya's jaw tightened. Someone. Rain's eyes narrowed. Him. Arya met his gaze, silent confirmation. Rain exhaled slowly, pressing his lips into a hard line. Then it's not a drill anymore. The words struck harder than any order. Not a drill, a threat, a shadow stepping into daylight. Arya folded her arms, holding herself still, because stillness was the only thing keeping her from breaking. The recruits can't know. Not yet. Rain's voice dropped, and when it reaches them. Arya's silence answered. Because she knew it would. That night she dreamed again. The pool, the ropes, the voice of her father. Panic kills faster than water. She had believed it. She had clung to it, but panic wasn't the only thing that killed. Sometimes survival did too. She woke before dawn, chest heaving, the barracks still dark. Her hand reached instinctively for the folder, as though the word retribution could anchor her. But paper couldn't stop ghosts. She rose quietly, boots silent on the concrete floor. Outside, the desert was pale under moonlight, stretching endless, a graveyard of secrets. She scanned the perimeter. Empty. But she felt it again, the presence. The way air thickened when eyes pressed against you from unseen places. She wasn't wrong. She never had been. 2 days later it happened. The recruits were deep into a canyon drill, learning to move as a unit across harsh terrain. The sun carved shadows across the jagged rock, the air dry and merciless. Arya marched with them, her eyes never resting. She forced them into silence, into trust, into reliance on one another. Halfway through she froze. A figure moved along the ridge above them. Too smooth, too deliberate, not one of hers. Her stomach clenched. "Down," she ordered, her voice low but sharp. The recruits obeyed instantly, dropping to cover behind stone. Rain at her side followed her gaze. He saw it too. The figure lingered for a moment, then vanished into shadow. The recruits whispered, confused. Who was that? Is this part of the drill? Arya's voice cut through them, calm but lethal. This isn't a drill. Their eyes widened. Fear cracked their composure. Arya crouched low, scanning the ridges. Her pulse pounded not with panic but with memory. Kandahar all over again. Shadows above water. Voices pressing her down. The fight for breath. But this time she wasn't bound, and she wasn't alone. Still, she knew the danger. Whoever it was, they hadn't come for the recruits. They had come for her. But the recruits were here anyway, and that made them targets. She exhaled slowly, grounding herself. Control, always control. Form tight, move low, stay silent, she ordered. They obeyed, their training carrying them even through confusion. Reneur's jaw was tight, Lee's eyes steady, Tor's trembling but following. They didn't understand, but they trusted her. And that trust cut deeper than any blade. They moved through the canyon, the silence oppressive. Every scrape of boot against stone echoed like thunder. Arya led them with deliberate precision, every sense alive. She felt eyes above, tracking them, not just one pair, more. Her chest tightened. This wasn't just him. He hadn't come alone. She signaled Rain with a subtle hand. He nodded, slipping off to flank the formation, his rifle low but ready. The recruits followed her, their breaths shallow, their eyes darting. Fear was in them now, but so was discipline. They didn't break, not yet. Then a rock tumbled from the ridge. The recruits flinched, some ducking, others gripping their rifles tighter. Arya's voice cut the silence. Steady. But inside her heart roared. Because she knew. The past wasn't just watching anymore. It was hunting. When they finally reached the extraction point, the recruits sagged in exhaustion, sweat streaking their faces. Relief began to bloom until Arya raised her fist. Eyes up, she hissed. Across the ridge, silhouetted against the fatting sun, stood a figure, still as stone, watching. The recruits froze, hearts hammering. And then in the dying light, Arya saw his face. Older, scarred, but unmistakable. The man from Kandahar. Her throat tightened. The air left her lungs as though the water had closed in again. She gripped the edge of a boulder, steadying herself. The recruit stared, whispering, "Who is that? What's happening?" Rain's voice was low, grim. They weren't supposed to see him. Arya's chest ached. She knew she couldn't hide anymore, not from them, not from him. The figure on the ridge raised a hand, not in greeting, not in surrender, in promise. Then he stepped back into shadow and was gone. The recruits turned to Arya, eyes wide, waiting for answers. But she had none to give. Not yet. Instead, she whispered the words only she could hear. "It's him." And for the first time since the pool, fear cracked her armor. That night back at the base, silence suffocated the barracks. The recruits whispered in the dark, restless and uneasy. Who had been on the ridge? Why had Major Monroe frozen when she saw him? Why had Captain Rain gone pale? Arya sat alone in her quarters, hands pressed flat to the desk, the folder open before her. The word retribution stared back, sharp as a blade. Her voice, low, broke into the silence. "He's coming." And she knew this wasn't just her test anymore. It was theirs. Why did silence feel heavier than gunfire? The barracks should have been still that night. Recruits, exhausted from drills, usually collapsed into restless but deep sleep. But tonight, no one slept. The air buzzed with whispers, too soft to carry but sharp enough to cut through the dark. Who was he? Why did she freeze? Why didn't Captain Rain say anything? Reneur lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, jaw clenched. Tors turned on his side again and again, unable to keep still. Lee, though quiet, kept her eyes open, watching the shadows. They had followed Arya through fire, through humiliation, through transformation. They had believed in her. But on the canyon ridge they had seen something they couldn't unsee. Their leader, the unbreakable Major Monroe, had faltered. And faltering was dangerous. Arya sat in her quarters, the folder spread open before her. The single word retribution glared up like an accusation. She had read the page until the ink seemed to bleed into her vision. The name beneath it burned her like iron against flesh. She whispered it now, too low for anyone to hear. And still, it felt like speaking it had power. The man from Kandahar. Alive. Her mind replayed the pool, the ropes, the cold, the way his eyes had widened before going still. She had sworn that was the end. She had sworn she had buried it. But ghosts don't drown. And now those ghosts wanted more than silence. They wanted her recruits. At dawn, she gathered them on the yard. The desert sun hadn't yet burned the air into heat, but the tension was hotter than fire. They stood in formation, eyes sharp, shoulders rigid. They didn't look at her like they had before. Respect was still there, but beneath it questions, fear, doubt. Arya stepped forward, boots heavy against the concrete. Her silence stretched long enough to scrape against nerves. Then she spoke. What you saw yesterday was not part of training. The recruit stiffened. That man is real, and he's here for me. Gasps cracked through the formation. Rener's voice tight with disbelief. Who is he? Arya's eyes locked on him. He's the reason I survived Kandahar, and the reason I haven't slept in years. Confusion twisted across their faces. Tors frowned, Lee narrowed her eyes, Rener clenched his jaw. Arya drew a slow breath. This was the moment she had fought against, the one she had hoped would never come. But leadership wasn't silence. Leadership was truth. I was taken in Kandahar, bound, dropped into water just like this pool. They thought they could break me. He thought he could break me. But I didn't drown, I fought, I escaped, and I left him there. Her voice faltered for a heartbeat. I thought he died. The silence that followed was suffocating. The recruits shifted, processing. Tor's eyes widened. Lee's face hardened. Rener's fists clenched at his sides. Arya's voice dropped. But command tells me he lived, and now he wants retribution. The word tasted bitter on her tongue. For the first time since the pool, the recruits didn't look at her as unbreakable. They looked at her as human, and the truth of it terrified them. One voice broke the silence. Lee, quiet, steady, cutting through the fear. Then we stand with you. The words landed like steel. Rener barked a bitter laugh. Stand with her, against him, whoever the hell he is. We don't even know what we're walking into. Lee's gaze cut to him. We don't have to know, she stood with us. Now it's our turn. The recruits murmured, some nodding, some shaking their heads. Division cracked the line. Arya raised a hand, silencing them. Her chest tightened. They didn't understand. This wasn't their fight. It wasn't supposed to be. You don't stand with me in this, she said. Her voice was sharp, but beneath it was the fracture of fear. This isn't your war. But Tors, trembling, stepped forward. With respect, ma'am, isn't it now? The words hung in the air, heavier than sand, sharper than any blade. Because he was right. If Kandahar had returned, then none of them were outside it anymore. Later that day, the storm broke. The recruits were mid-drill, scaling obstacles in the searing heat, when the first shot cracked through the air. It wasn't part of training. The recruits dove for cover instinctively. Arya's voice cut across the yard. Stay down. Rain sprinted to her side, weapon drawn, eyes scanning the ridges. Another shot rang out, hitting the concrete wall inches from Tor's head. Panic threatened, but Arya's voice steadied them. Eyes on me, do not break. She scanned the horizon, and there, silhouetted against the glare, he stood, rifle in hand, watching. Her chest roared with heat, not fear, recognition. Him. Alive. The recruits whispered in terror. Some cursed, some shook, but Arya didn't move. Her voice low and hard. He's not here for you, he's here for me. The figure raised his rifle again. This time the shot tore dust at her feet, deliberate, A warning. Her heart pounded, but her hand stayed steady. She stepped forward, away from the recruits, into the open. Rain hissed through his teeth. "What are you doing?" "Ending this," Arya said. Her boots echoed across the yard as she walked into the line of fire, into the shadow of her past. The recruits watched, fear hollowing their faces, but something else too, respect, deeper than before. Not for her strength, for her choice. She stopped in the open, sunlight carving steel across her shoulders. Her voice rang out across the desert. "You should have stayed buried." The man lowered his rifle just enough for her to see his face, scarred, hardened, but alive. And then he smiled. "Retribution," he called. The word ripped through the air like a blade. And Arya knew the time for silence was over. That night, as the recruits sat in tense silence, Lee whispered the question they all carried. "What happens now?" Arya stood at the front of the room, her shadow cast long against the wall. Her voice was steady, though her heart roared. "Now," she said, "we rise." Why does the past never stay buried? The desert was silent, the kind of silence that tightens the lungs before the storm. The recruits waited in tense formation, weapons near, eyes restless. Captain Rain stood at Arya's side, but he didn't speak. He didn't have to. They all knew what was coming. The figure had already declared himself. Retribution. The word still lingered in the air, sharp as the crack of a rifle. Arya stood alone at the front, her posture rigid, her face unreadable. But inside, her chest roared with fire. She had avoided this moment for years. She had buried Kandahar beneath training, beneath missions, beneath silence. But silence could only last so long. And now the desert had given her no choice. "Stay here," she told Rain. Her voice was sharp, final. He shook his head. "You don't have to face him alone." Her eyes cut to his, hard as steel. "Yes, I do." The recruits exchanged uneasy glances. They wanted to speak, to protest, but the weight of her command pressed them silent. Arya turned, stepping out of the compound into the pale light of dawn. The desert stretched wide, dunes rippling under the wind. And there, at the edge of the horizon, he waited. The man from Kandahar. Alive. Scar carved across his cheek, eyes hard, rifle slung low at his side. He hadn't come to hide in shadow this time. He had come to stand in the open. Their gazes locked across the distance. Years collapsed. Kandahar rose between them. She walked forward, each step deliberate, boots sinking into sand. The recruits watched from behind the wire, every breath caught. When she stopped 10 paces away, the air between them hummed with silence. "You should have drowned," she said quietly. His lips curled into something colder than a smile. "And you should have died with me." The words cut deep. She felt the pool, the rope, the water closing in. She felt his hands grabbing for her as she tore free. She felt the silence when his body went still. Her voice was low. "I thought you were gone." "You wanted me gone," he spat. "You chose yourself. You chose breath over loyalty. And now you wear a uniform like it makes you clean." The recruits couldn't hear his words, but they saw his rage, saw her stillness. And it shook them because they realized leadership wasn't born of perfection. It was born of scars. Arya's chest tightened. His words were knives, reopening wounds she had tried to stitch shut, but she didn't flinch. "I chose survival," she said, "because survival was the only way I could fight again." He stepped closer, eyes burning. "And now you teach them to follow you, to worship you. Do they know the truth? Do they know you killed me to save yourself?" Her jaw clenched. She didn't look back at the recruits, but she felt their eyes, their trust, their doubt. And she realized the truth could no longer stay buried. She turned slightly, her voice carrying across the desert, loud enough for them all to hear. "Yes, I left him in Kandahar. I survived because he did not." The words cracked the air like a whip. Gasps rippled through the recruits. "But survival isn't betrayal," she continued. Her voice steadied, cutting sharp. "It is a debt, and I've paid it every day since, in every mission, in every life I refuse to let fall, in every one of you." Her eyes locked on him again. "You think retribution makes you strong. It doesn't. It chains you to the past. I broke free. That's why I rise. That's why they rise." The man's face twisted with rage. He raised his rifle. The recruits tensed behind the wire. Rain's hand hovered at his sidearm. Arya didn't move. Her voice was low, steady. "You're not here to kill me. You're here to break me. But I've already been broken, and every time I rose again." The man's finger twitched on the trigger, but something in her stillness stopped him. The desert wind whipped between them, carrying her words like steel. "You drowned that night," she whispered. "Not in water, in hate, and you've been drowning ever since." The silence stretched, his hands shook, the rifle wavered. Then, with a guttural cry, he lowered it, not to surrender, but because he could not pull the trigger. He had come for retribution, but found no weakness left to break. Arya stepped closer, her shadow falling across his. "I forgive you." The words landed harder than any shot. His face twisted, rage breaking into something hollow. His knees buckled. The rifle dropped into the sand. The desert swallowed his sob like it had swallowed her silence years ago. She stood above him, not triumphant, not vengeful, just steady, just alive. She turned, walking back to the recruits. Their faces were pale, wide-eyed, struggling to process what they had seen. She stopped before them, waterless desert wind tugging at her uniform. "You want to know what leadership is?" Her voice was quiet but carried. "Leadership isn't never falling. It isn't being flawless. It's standing when you've been broken. It's carrying scars without letting them own you. It's refusing to let hate decide who you are." The recruits straightened, one by one, not out of fear, not out of obedience, out of something deeper. "Respect." She scanned their faces, letting the silence press. Then she spoke the words that would outlast her. "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." And in the stillness of the desert, every one of them understood. Not because she told them, but because they had seen her rise. And now they knew they could too.